misunderstood, despised, rejected. 17th of April 2025. Yesterday we followed Jesus as he got angry with those who were defiling the holy temple in Jerusalem. I wonder if he slept last night knowing that this would be his penultimate day, finding himself alone, hated by the religious leaders who saw him as a threat to their status, as being dangerous, threatening their rule under the acceptance and permission of the Romans, who barely tolerated their religion. Indeed, they sought to destroy Judaism and the Jews, who would not bow down to worship the Roman emperor, who they believed to be their god, alongside the many other gods and goddesses who they worshipped in every aspect of life. Rebellion was in the air, and the high priesthood who ran the temple, as well as the Romans, were afraid of the hordes of Jewish people who had come for Passover, an angry, volatile crowd who looked to Jesus as the one who would overthrow the Roman occupation and restore the Jewish religion. But these crowds are beginning to turn from Jesus, who they thought would have come as a warrior, riding on a white horse as the Roman generals did when they had conquered the city. The long-awaited Messiah was a disappointment to them, coming on a lowly donkey without the riches of the conquering king, a rabbi who taught instead of fought. The atmosphere was tense, electric. It seemed that something huge was about to happen. Yet no one understood what Jesus did as he rode in. This would lead to his death and his resurrection. How was he feeling, surrounded by people, 120 disciples by this time, as well as many followers, who he loved and from whom he needed understanding and support in his time of trial? Yet there was no one. His disciples were excited about the coming feast, overwhelmed by what was going on around them, but also squabbling among themselves, vying for position, and one who he knew would betray him. Yet there was one who he knew truly loved him. Jesus himself was unsettled. Could it even be that he was volatile? Matthew's account in chapter 21, verse 17, tells us that he had spent the night in Beit Anya, Bethany, which means house of poverty. The next morning, on his way back to the city, he felt hungry. Spotting a fig tree by the road, he went up to it, but found nothing on it except leaves. So he said to it, "May you never again bear fruit." And immediately the fig tree dried up. The disciples saw this and were amazed. "How did the fig tree dry up so quickly?" they asked. Yeshua answered them, "Yes, I tell you, if you have trust and don't doubt, you will not only do what was done to this fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, 'Go and throw yourself into the sea,' it will be done." In other words, you will receive everything you ask for in prayer, no matter what it is, provided you have trust. But was Jesus' cursing and drying up of the fig tree an angry reaction to disappointment because he couldn't satisfy his hunger? Wouldn't that have been out of character, even a sin? No, Jesus is making the point by means of prophetic drama, a parable acted out. We see other example of this in the Bible. For example, in Jeremiah 19, we read about Jeremiah buying and then breaking a clay bottle, and Ezekiel made and then burned up a model of Jerusalem, Ezekiel 4:5, which was a metaphor for the judgment of God on the people of Israel because of idolatry, wickedness, and rejection of the government. As we know, following this, Jerusalem was destroyed and Israel scattered. The surrounding nations also receive the judgments of God because of their wickedness. Looking at the world today, God's judgment is not far away, if not actually upon us. Later on in Acts 21, 10-11, Luke tells a story about a prophet named Agabus, who took Paul's belt, tied up his own hands and feet, and said, "Here is what the Holy Spirit says. The man who owns this belt, the Judeans in Jerusalem, will tie him up just like this and hand him over to the Gentiles," thereby causing Paul's followers to warn him not to go to Jerusalem. But why the fig tree? Even out of season, the fig tree in leaf holds forth the promise of fruit. The normal early season for figs in Israel is June, but the early unripe fruit in Song of Songs 2:13 begins to show itself even before the spring leaves appear on the branches, often before Passover. We know that Jesus expected God's people to put forth the fruit of righteousness, and that unproductive branches are thrown in the fire. Matthew 7:16-20, 12:33, 13:4-9, and 18:23, and also in John 15:1-8. Thus, the drying up of the fig tree is an acted out warning. In Proverbs 27:18, King Solomon told us that he who tends a fig tree would eat its fruit, and he who serves his master will be honoured. Jesus here is teaching his followers what it means to serve their master, God. It means simply to have the kind of trust that comes from God, which Jesus states in verse 22, and that they will wither away if they don't have that kind of trust. The day before, he had been angry with those leaders, merchants and money changers who were exploiting the poor for their own gains, totally disregarding the rules and regulations that God had commanded when he brought them out of Egypt. They knew all of these laws, and yet they disobeyed. Where was their faith and their trust in God? But Jesus, regarding the fig tree, was neither angry nor performing any kind of miracle or magic act. Every one of his supernatural acts has spiritual significance. Jesus then went into the temple area, we read in Matthew 21, verse 23, and as he was teaching, the head priests and the elders of the people approached him and demanded, What authority do you have that authorizes you to do these things? And who gave you this authority? The Hebrew word used here for authority is semicha, which means leaning or laying on of hands in the ordination ceremony for a judge, elder, or rabbi. The laying on of hands in the Old Testament is a symbolic act that confers or transfers an office. A rabbinic ordination allows the recipient the right to judge them to decide on halakha, Jewish traditional law. Jesus, we know, was a rabbi. But here the priests and elders are basically asking him, what kind of ordination did you receive that entitles you to teach us as authoritatively as you do, to decide points of law as you do, and to disturb the peace in the temple courts? Matthew tells us in verses 45 and 46, as the head priests and the Pharisees listened to his stories, they saw that he was speaking about them. But when they set about to arrest him, they were afraid of the crowds, because the crowds considered him a prophet. As we know, they were so disturbed by Jesus that they eventually arrested him, put him on trial, and subsequently turned him over to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, who had him crucified. But before that, I want to tell you about someone who really did love Jesus and supported him with a beautiful gesture, which we can read about in John chapter 12. This happened a few days before Passover. the evening before Jesus rode into Bethlehem on the donkey. But I want to mention this incident because I think it sheds light on the tensions at that time, and also mentions someone who we will be hearing about later on. 6 days before Passover, John tells us, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus lived, the man Jesus had raised from the dead. So they gave a dinner there in his honor. Martha served the meal, and Lazarus was among those at the table with him. Miriam, or Mary, according to the anglicized version of her name, took a whole pint of pure oil of spikenard, which is very expensive, poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair, so that the house was filled with the fragrance of perfume. But one of the disciples, Judas from Iscariot, the one who was about to betray him, said, "This perfume is worth a year's wages. Why wasn't it sold and the money given to the poor?" Now he said this not out of concern for the poor, but because he was a thief. He was in charge of the common purse and used to steal from it. Jesus said, "Leave her alone. She kept this for the day of my burial. You always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me." So another important story, a cameo portrait of tenderness and loving kindness that again speaks volumes to those who know some of the background of the story. We've heard of this family before. Jesus often visited this house, and we have heard that Mary loved to listen to his words and learn from him, while Martha, her sister, frazzled with making sure the meal was just right and the visitors were well cared for, had no time at all to stop and listen to anything or anybody. You can read about Martha's frustration in Luke chapter 10, 38-42. On their way, Jesus and his disciples came to a village where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. She had a sister called Miriam, who also sat at the Lord's feet and heard what he had to say. But Martha was busy with all the work to be done, so going up to him she said, "Sir, don't you care that my sister has been leaving me to do all the work by myself?" However, the Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are fretting and worrying about so many things, but there's only one thing that is essential. Miriam has chosen the right thing, and it won't be taken away from her." I think most of us can sympathize with Martha, and I can just imagine the two sisters squabbling about this later, the atmosphere thick with anger and resentment. And it is true that most women at that time would have had the responsibility of keeping house, cooking, cleaning, washing, making and mending clothes, growing vegetables, maybe even looking after animals, as well as shopping and welcoming guests, and would have seen this as a priority. No wonder, without our modern appliances and conveniences, Martha was overwhelmed. Jesus respects the work that needs to be done in the household, and Jews, as well as Christians, are encouraged to serve others. Hospitality was, and still is, crucially important in Jewish culture. Remember way back in Genesis when Abraham welcomed guests? From Genesis 18, 1-8. The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre, while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and there in front of him stood 3 men. On seeing them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them, and bowed low to the ground. He said, "If I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, please don't leave your servant. Please let me send for some water so that you may wash your feet. Then rest under the tree, and I will bring a piece of bread. Now that you have come to your servant, refresh yourselves before going on." "Very well," they answered, "do as you say." So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah. Quickly, 3 measures of the best flour. Knead it and make cakes." Abraham ran to the herd, took a good tender calf, and gave it to the servant, who hurried to prepare it. He then took curds, milk, and the calf which he had prepared, and set it all before the men, and he stood by them under the tree as they ate. Evidently, Abraham was bending over backwards to show hospitality towards these strangers. Jewish studies tell us that his tent was open on 3 sides, so that he would see people coming from any direction in order to be able to offer them hospitality. So important was it to him. Mamre, located in Hebron, is the site where Abraham pitched the tents for his camp. We read in Genesis 13:18. The oaks of Mamre would have provided welcome shade from the heat of the sun and maybe some shelter from storms. It was extremely hot and dusty, and travellers appreciated and even depended on hospitality from people when they were en route. Abraham did not know who these visitors were, but it is obvious from this story that he did everything he could to make them welcome, comfortable, and provided for. Washing their feet after walking in the dirty, dusty ground, resting in the shade, and being provided with a nourishing meal was a blessing to all who received this show of loving kindness. And in return, Abraham himself was to receive a blessing. Later, Moses received the commandments written on stone tablets on Mount Sinai, the first commandment being to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your mind, with all of your strength. This is the first and greatest biblical commandment. The second is to love your neighbour as yourself. Abraham's first act, when settling in Mamre, was to build an altar to God. In these verses, it is evident that he was also obeying the second commandment in showing hospitality to these 3 strangers, who we know turned out to be angels. In Genesis 12, God promised to make a great nation and people from Abraham's seed. Likewise, Abraham would become a blessing to all nations. In Genesis 17, God confirmed this covenant, telling Abraham and his Jewish descendants that they were to be set apart for God through circumcision, and this would be a reminder for all generations. The traditional circumcision, or Brit Milah, shortened formed bris, according to Genesis 17:9-12, always takes place on the 8th day of the baby's life. The only legitimate exception is when the infant is ill. But in Genesis 17, verse 24, we read that Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, and Ishmael his son was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. Abraham and Ishmael his son were circumcised on the same day, and all of the men in his household, both slaves born in his house and those bought with money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him. What is so remarkable about Abraham's hospitality is that, obeying God's command in Genesis 9:14, Abraham, his son Ishmael, and all males in his household had been circumcised only 2 days before the visitors arrived. I've not had the experience myself, but I have been told that the 3rd day is the most painful day of all, and Abraham, being 99 years old, suffering from circumcision in this most sensitive area, resting in his tent in the heat of the day, as we are told, looked up, saw these strangers in front of his eyes, and immediately rushed to look after them. And not just him, but his servants too. He ignored his pain and his suffering to obey this great commandment. But back to Mary and Martha, showing hospitality to Jesus, his disciples, preparing a meal for them and all of the family, including Lazarus. I think we can now see that the tension between Mary and Martha was indeed great. Poor Martha. But Jesus prioritizes sincere, humble faith over traditional standards and cultural norms. The fact that Mary dared to break this cultural role in society shows that she was very hungry to hear all that Jesus was teaching. Jesus said that Mary had chosen the right thing. Martha, too, could have sat at his feet, but it seems she was unable to brush aside the responsibilities that had been laid upon her. Duty in the form of work was her choice. Mary then began to wash Jesus' feet, which, as we see as far back as Abraham, was a common custom and also a sign of honour in ancient society, no matter how bizarre it may seem to us today. The Roman pound was equal to slightly more than 320 grams, or about 12 ounces. Nard is an oil-producing plant, the rhizomes of which were crushed to produce an extravagant aromatic oil. The contents of the jar were therefore very expensive. Bethany, where they lived, was home to many poor and disadvantaged people. They were taken care of by the hard work of villagers and the sacrificial donations of others. Funds were always lacking, and this was enough to make Judas Iscariot criticize Mary harshly for owning such an expensive item. However, I wonder if his anger in his criticism of her was partly due to his guilt. Mary was showing great love, generosity, and also care and concern for Jesus, maybe understanding more than the men who surrounded him that he was struggling emotionally and physically exhausted. Judas, on the other hand, although I do not believe for 1 minute that he thought the end results would be Jesus' death on the cross, rather he wished to provoke a rebellion by causing him to be arrested and his followers rising up against the authorities, taking back control of Jerusalem, as had been done in the days of the Maccabees nearly 200 years beforehand. Yet whatever the reason he had for his actions, Judas knew he was about to betray his master and his friend, whom he had followed day and night for the last 3 years. We have no idea where or how she would have obtained such an expensive jar of perfume, and this may be the reason why she is often confused with, but not the same Mary, as the prostitute of Luke 7:36-50. In Judaism and many other cultures in the ancient world, and still today in the Middle East, hair was associated with a woman's glory, self-wealth, and self-respect. Not only did Mary pour an extremely expensive ointment on the feet of Jesus, she also used her hair to wipe the oil that did not get absorbed into Jesus' skin. In other words, she placed her self-worth at his feet. She humbled herself, giving him her riches and her glory. It was an act of complete love and unselfishness. And how was Jesus feeling throughout all of this? So much tension, the frustration of Martha, Judas' anger towards Mary, frowned upon for wasting her precious oil, and possibly scorned by the other disciples, displeased by her obvious pouring out of herself in her love for Jesus. He would have known what was in the hearts of all, and as well as wondering what would become of the disciples when he was no longer there to lead them, what would become of Mary? And so we come to the penultimate day. Tomorrow, the day when Jesus would eat a final meal with his disciples, celebrating the first meal of the Passover, but a last supper for him. He longs for you and I to take time throughout our busy daily lives to sit at his feet and soak in his presence. When Mary sat at Jesus' feet, she was devoted to him and listened to his words carefully. It would have warmed his heart. And I know that if we choose to sit at his feet, casting aside our responsibilities, taking time away out of our busy lives, just to sit at his feet, to pour out our love on him as he pours his love out on us, his heart will be warmed. He longs to love us as much as we long to be with him.